Hello everyone, my name is Ella Reuter. I'm a student writing intern at the College of Letters and Sciences, and today I talked with Barry Burden, who is a professor here at UW-Madison, as well as the director of the Elections Research Center. And today we talked about the midterm elections and what the results mean.
My name is Barry Burden. I'm a professor of political science and director of the Elections Research Center here at UW-Madison.
So going into these midterm elections, many feared for the state of democracy. Some experts even referred to democracy itself as being on the ballot. What do the results of the election tell us about the current and future state of democracy?
There were so many good signs about democracy coming out of this year's elections. The losing candidates in most states and districts conceded the election gracefully and quickly. We feared that might not happen in some states, especially in close competitive battleground states where there's been a lot of questioning of election practices since 2020. There were no real disruptions at the polls from election observers. That was another fear that we thought might come to pass. There have not been significant protests in states, even where there's still close elections that are not decided. So overall, a very positive election experience. Now, there were a number of election deniers who were on the ballot across the country, especially in swing states. Many of them were elected and will now be in office as we get into the next election cycle in 2024. That really couldn't be prevented, but I think the major story is that it was a great night for election administration in this country, and hopefully will lead to greater confidence for voters who had some skepticism or doubts coming out of 2020.
And many pundits expected the Republican Party to ride a red wave to an overwhelming majority in both the House and the Senate, and it didn't quite work out that way. What stopped the red wave and what will come from this?
Yeah, the red wave was expected, I think, for a good reason. It is the historic pattern that the party in the White House will lose seats in Congress and in governorships and in state legislatures in a midterm election. And those losses tend to be bigger when there's unified government at the federal level, and it has been unified Democratic control. And yet Democrats, I think, have come out with a pretty good outcome from their point of view. So what caused Republicans to fall short? I think there are a few things happening simultaneously. One is that Republicans actually made gains 2 years ago in the 2020 election. Even though Donald Trump lost at the top of the ticket, Joe Biden won, Republicans did pretty well down the ballot. I think we forget that because of the focus on the presidential election. Republicans gained seats in the House 2 years ago and almost won control of Congress. There were 2 runoff elections in Georgia 2 months after Election Day that led to a 50-50 tie there. So it was actually a good year for Republicans. And I think that left them less to go after this time around. Many of the swing states and swing districts had already swung their way in 2020. The other thing I think was working on Democrats' behalf was the abortion decision from the Supreme Court in the spring that overruled Roe v. Wade. Especially during the summer, that seemed to energize Democratic voters, and some of their candidates really led in the polls in states where we weren't expecting that to happen. Some of that faded as we got into the fall when voters turned their attention back to immigration and crime and inflation especially. But it did seem to energize a set of voters who were very concerned about that, and I think offsets some of the advantages Republicans had in making the election about Joe Biden. One last factor I think worked to Democrats' advantage, and that was Donald Trump actually being a factor in this year's elections. It's pretty unusual for a former president, especially one who lost the last election, to be a very visible presence in the next midterm election. Typically, presidents go quietly from their office. Donald Trump didn't do that, and he was holding rallies around the country in the summer and some in the fall. He was in the news for other reasons, including the raid that happened on some of his papers he had taken to Mar-a-Lago. And so that made it a bit more of a comparison in voters' minds between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. That was a more even race versus what could have been just a referendum on Democrats in office and people's unhappiness with the economy and other things that probably would have worked more to Republicans' advantage.
Here in Wisconsin, Governor Tony Evers was re-elected governor, but the Wisconsin legislature somehow picked up more Republicans. How does that happen?
Well, I would say Wisconsin was sort of a split decision here. The Governor Tony Evers did win re-election by a bigger margin than I think a lot of people expected. He's ahead by about 3.5 percentage points. Incumbent Senator Ron Johnson won re-election, but by a smaller margin, just 1 point. So on average, it looks like the Democrats got a little better of those two races, with the Democratic incumbent winning by a bigger margin than the Republican incumbent. Democrats also won a couple of other statewide races. It looks like they won Attorney General and Secretary of State. But their success really stops when you get to the state legislature. And that was true in 2020 and also true in the last midterm election in 2018, when Democrats won all 5 statewide races and made no gains in the state legislature. The legislature is really playing by a different set of election rules. The members there are elected from districts. Those districts have been drawn to favor Republicans intentionally. There's also something about the makeup of where Democratic and Republican voters live in the state that makes it hard for Democrats to get kind of equal parity in terms of representation in the legislature. So both because of the geography of the state where people live, and also intentional efforts by Republicans who drew the maps last time and really got to carry over to a very similar set of maps for this set of elections, there's a built-in advantage for the GOP, and the makeup of the state legislature doesn't really vacillate as the voters in Wisconsin swing back and forth, sometimes favoring Democrats heavily, sometimes favoring Republicans. The makeup of the legislature is pretty solid, and this time around actually led to small Republican gains.